Marcus Chen had spent 20 years building an empire from nothing. Born in the margins of the city, raised by a mother who cleaned hotels at night, he'd clawed his way through business school and venture capital to become one of the youngest black billionaires in the country. His wedding to Victoria Ashford, daughter of a pharmaceutical dynasty, was meant to be the final seal on his arrival. In power, married to legacy, wealth multiplied by connection. But on that Saturday morning, standing at the altar in a cathedral of marble and roses, Marcus saw something that shattered everything he'd constructed. The maid arranging flowers in the back of the church was someone he'd promised to forget, someone whose name he'd buried beneath a decade of ambition. And in that moment, watching her trembling hands adjust white lilies, Marcus understood that all his money, all his success, all his carefully curated life was built on a foundation of lies and one unpaid debt. What began as the wedding of the year became the story that would expose the truth, that a man's character is measured not by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to sacrifice. That recognition, true recognition of another human being's worth, is the rarest luxury a billionaire can afford. And that sometimes redemption means walking away from everything you've built to reclaim the one thing that matters. This is the story of a man who chose humanity over empire, and the woman whose quiet dignity reminded him who he used to be. Chapter 1. The Cathedral. The morning light filtered through stained glass in shades of sapphire and gold. Marcus stood before the mirror in the cathedral's vestry, adjusting his custom Ermenegildo Zegna tie for the third time. His best man, David, watched with the careful attention of someone who knew this moment was more transaction than romance. "You look like a man about to sign the most important deal of your life," David said. Marcus forced a smile. "That's exactly what this is." The words felt true in a way he'd trained himself to accept. Victoria was brilliant in her own right. Harvard law, family connections spanning 3 continents, an aesthetic so polished it belonged in magazines. They complemented each other like 2 pieces of premium real estate that, when combined, tripled in value. Their merger made sense on every spreadsheet, every projection, every rational calculation his mind had learned to worship. He could hear the string quartet beginning outside, guests settling into their seats, the machinery of an 8-figure event grinding into motion. Marcus looked at himself in the mirror, tailored, powerful, untouchable. This was the man he'd become, the man who'd erased his past, the man who didn't remember promises made in the dark. He walked toward the chapel, each step measured, controlled. The doors opened, the music swelled. And then he saw her, not Victoria, walking down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's homes. His eyes had shifted to the back corner, where the florist's assistant was arranging the final bouquets. Her hands moved with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she was thinking about something, or someone, far away. She was older now, worn in places that wealth could never touch, but her face, the angle of her jaw, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the small scar above her left eyebrow, these details blazed into his memory with a clarity that made him dizzy. It was Eleanor, whom he'd met when they were both 19. Eleanor, who'd worked 3 jobs to support her younger brother. Eleanor, who'd believed in him before he believed in himself. Eleanor, who'd waited for him to finish his MBA, who'd believed his promises that when he made it, they'd build something together. Elena, whom he'd abandoned the moment his first venture capitalist said marriage to a working-class woman would complicate his brand. That was 11 years ago. Marcus's hands began to shake. The chapel tilted slightly. He could feel David's hand on his shoulder, Victoria reaching for his arm, the priest opening his mouth to begin the ceremony. But all he could see was Elena's face, older, sadder, but still unmistakably Elena, and the realization that hit him like a physical blow. He had not forgotten her at all. He had simply paid enough money to believe he had. The flower arrangement she was adjusting was trembling. She'd seen him, she'd recognized him too, and the expression on her face, a mixture of disbelief, pain, and something that looked like forgiveness, broke something in him that no amount of success had ever been able to repair. Victoria was speaking to him. The priest was waiting. Hundreds of eyes were watching. But Marcus was thinking about a boy who'd promised a girl he'd never leave her behind, a boy who'd meant it with every fiber of his being, before ambition had taught him how to mean nothing at all. He opened his mouth. The truth rose up from somewhere he'd buried it so deep he'd convinced himself it no longer existed. Chapter 2. The Reconstruction. To understand what happened at the altar, you have to understand two parallel lives that had been running on different tracks for 11 years. Marcus's world was one of ascending brightness, corner offices with views that spanned the city, board meetings where his voice commanded silence, penthouse apartments decorated by designers whose names appeared in footnotes of architectural magazines, success that felt like a kind of escape velocity. The higher he rose, the further away the earth became, and with it, all the memories attached to ground level. He'd worked with a therapist once, an expensive one, recommended by his wealth manager, who'd suggested that ambition was sometimes a form of forgetting. Marcus had paid for 6 sessions and then stopped attending. The insight was too close to the bone. His engagement to Victoria had felt like the final seal on his transformation. She represented a world he'd always believed was the only world that mattered. Her family had generational wealth. She'd never worked a day she didn't choose to. She moved through life with the assumption that the world was arranged for her comfort, and the world had spent enough time proving her right that she'd never questioned the arrangement. She'd been lovely to him, never demanding, never curious about his past in the way that felt intrusive. She'd accepted his success as a natural fact, the way water accepts its own wetness. But she'd never believed in him. She'd simply believed in what he'd become. Elena's world had contracted rather than expanded. After Marcus left, she'd continued working. The jobs had multiplied rather than diminished. Day shifts at a laundry facility, evening shifts cleaning offices, weekend shifts working catering at hotels. Her younger brother, Diego, had made it through community college. He was working at a tech startup now, doing better than either of them had imagined. Sometimes he offered to help with her rent. She always refused. Pride was one of the few things poverty couldn't take away. She'd moved into a small apartment in the neighborhood where they'd first met, the same neighborhood Marcus had grown up in and spent the last decade actively avoiding. She'd never left the city. She'd never needed to. Everything she loved was here. She'd seen Marcus on magazine covers, billionaire at 35, youngest black CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She'd read the articles like someone reading about a person who died, that combination of pride and grief that comes when someone you knew transforms into someone you don't recognize. When a staffing agency called offering her work at a high-end catering company, she'd almost turned it down. The pay was better, but that meant the clients were wealthier, the scrutiny more intense, the feeling of invisibility more complete. She'd accepted anyway because her mother was sick, and medical bills had a way of making pride seem like a luxury item. The work was simple. Arrange flowers, pass drinks, disappear into the background. This was the skill she'd perfected, being so helpful as to be almost invisible. She'd learned that the wealthy didn't see people like her. They saw functions, the maid, the driver, the florist. They saw roles, not faces. It was safer that way, less complicated. She never imagined she'd see him again. Chapter 3. The Silence. The chapel held its breath. Marcus was still standing at the altar, his mouth open, his eyes locked on Elena's. Victoria had turned to follow his gaze, confusion blooming across her carefully maintained composure. The priest, sensing something had fractured in the ceremony's geometry, stopped mid-sentence. The silence stretched like a held note before it breaks. Elena had frozen, a spray of white orchids suspended in her hands. From where she stood, she could see everything: the altar, the bride, the groom's face, but the distance between them felt like it could be measured in years rather than feet. She moved to leave, the discretion of the invisible servant, knowing when she was no longer needed. But Marcus stepped forward. One step down from the altar, then another. "Wait," he said, not loudly, just clearly enough that everyone in the cathedral heard it. The murmur of the guests began, a wave of confusion rippling through the pews. Victoria's face had gone pale. David's hand shot out, as if to physically restrain his best friend, but Marcus was already moving. What struck Elena most was not anger in his expression. It was recognition. True recognition, the kind that saw her, not the role she was playing, the kind that acknowledged her existence as a person with an interior life, with a history, with the capacity to matter. She'd become so accustomed to being unseen that being truly seen felt like a kind of violence. "Don't," she said quietly, "don't do this." But Marcus was already at the steps where she stood, the cathedral descending into a chaos of whispered confusion. Phones were being raised. Someone was already live-streaming to social media. He looked at her for a long moment, not saying anything, just looking, the way you look at someone you're trying to remember correctly after years of forgetting them incorrectly. "I know you," he said finally. "You knew me," Elena corrected. "That was a long time ago." The orchids were still in her hands. One petal had fallen to the marble floor. They both watched it for a moment, a small, quiet moment of dissent. Behind them, Victoria had begun to cry. The sound cut through the chaos like a note of actual feeling in a symphony of performance. "I need you to know something," Marcus said. "I need everyone here to know something." He turned to face the assembled witnesses to his life, the business associates, the family connections, the carefully curated guest list that represented his ascent. "I made a promise 11 years ago," he said, "to someone I loved, and I broke it because I was afraid that the person she was wouldn't fit into the person I wanted to become." Elena felt her throat tighten. "But standing here," Marcus continued, "I'm realizing that the person I wanted to become was a lie. The person I became was a lie." He looked back at Elena. "And the only true thing I've ever said is that I loved her, that I still love her." Comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far stories like this, stories of people choosing truth over everything, can travel. Chapter 4. The Turning. Eleanor left the cathedral while the world was still reeling. She didn't run. She walked. The same way she walked through every space where she wasn't supposed to exist, deliberately without drawing attention. The florist, realizing his assistant had abandoned an arrangement mid-project, didn't try to stop her. The guests were too busy filming, tweeting, processing the implosion of the year's most high-profile wedding, to notice a woman in a grey catering uniform disappearing into the afternoon. But Marcus followed her. She was halfway down the cathedral steps when she heard his footsteps, the expensive Italian leather shoes that she could hear even in the chaos of his own unraveling. She didn't turn around. She simply kept walking, out into the November afternoon where the air was cool and carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. "Elena, please," he said. She stopped then, because hearing her name in his voice again, the inflection familiar, the feeling of it being spoken aloud by someone who knew exactly who she was, broke something in her that she'd spent 11 years carefully preserving. She turned to face him. He was still in his wedding suit. His tie was loose. His face was wet, though she couldn't tell if it was tears or sweat or the dampness of the approaching rain. "I don't know what you think just happened in there," Elena said quietly, "but I don't want your grand gesture. I don't want to be the redemption story you tell yourself. That's not what this is, isn't it?" Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "You made a choice a long time ago. I accepted that choice. I've made my own choices since then, and I don't need a billionaire to realize I'm a person." Marcus flinched, as if she'd struck him. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. I don't deserve to be forgiven. I don't deserve another chance. I'm not asking for that." "Then what are you asking for?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it. "I'm asking to remember who I was before I forgot how to be human." Rain began to fall then, soft at first, then harder. Neither of them moved. Around them, the city continued its rhythms. Cars passed, people hurried under umbrellas. The world that didn't care about their private tragedy spun on. Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something like the willingness to let forgiveness be possible. "You can't undo 11 years," she said. "You can't make up for the time. I know. You can't buy your way back to who you were. I know that too." She looked at him, standing in the rain, in his ruined wedding suit, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see. Vulnerability. Not the kind that came from loss of status, but the kind that came from genuine recognition of what had been broken. "My mother is sick," Elena said quietly. "She's been sick for 3 years. I've been paying for her care. That's why I took the catering job. That's why I was arranging flowers at a cathedral I could never afford to enter on my own." Marcus listened without speaking. "She asks about you sometimes," Elena continued. "She remembers you from when we first met. She always believed you'd come back. She always thought you were just scared." "I was scared," Marcus said. "I am scared." The rain intensified, and Elena realized that people were watching them from inside the cathedral. Victoria, the guests, the cameras still recording. The private moment was being transformed into public spectacle in real time, but neither of them moved. "Come with me," Marcus said. "Not because of what happened in there, but because I need to know if there's any possibility at all, that the boy your mother remembers could still exist." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand. Chapter 5. The Opposition. The news broke within hours. Billionaire CEO abandons bride at altar for cathedral maid. The headline cascaded across every news outlet, every social media platform, every digital space, where the wealthy could be publicly humiliated in real time. Victoria's family hired crisis management experts, lawyers, a publicist who specialized in reputation rehabilitation. They moved swiftly to control the narrative. Marcus was having a breakdown, they suggested. Mental health crisis, temporary psychological disturbance. The bride was a victim of his instability, not a participant in his choices. It was almost merciful, actually, the speed with which they rewrote reality to make it palatable. But Marcus's board of directors moved faster. He'd built his company on a reputation for flawless judgment and unwavering focus. Publicly abandoning a multi-million-dollar wedding to a woman from the working class, regardless of the romantic framing, was exactly the kind of unpredictability that spooked institutional investors. By Monday morning, emergency board meetings had been called. By Tuesday, the first of several votes had passed. His CEO position was being restructured. A sabbatical was being suggested. His stock options were becoming complicated by non-compete clauses that suddenly mattered very much to very powerful lawyers. The message was clear. Emotional instability was not a luxury the ultra-wealthy could afford to display. What was forgiven in a billionaire's private life was catastrophic in his professional one. David came to see him at his penthouse on Wednesday morning, the only friend who showed up in person rather than through a lawyer. "They're destroying you," David said flatly. "The board, Victoria's family, half the financial press. They're treating this like you committed treason." "Because I did," Marcus said. "I betrayed the person I was supposed to be." "Or to become the person you were supposed to be," David shot back. "Elena's in your apartment right now. She's been here for 3 days. Do you understand what your staff is saying? What the market is saying? This isn't a love story, Marcus. This is a career suicide disguised as redemption." They stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Marcus could see the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The neighborhood where Elena still lived, where she was caring for her mother, where everything he'd spent 20 years running away from was contained in 10 square blocks of declining real estate. "I know what I'm losing," Marcus said quietly. Do you really?" David's voice was hard. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making a choice you'll regret for the rest of your life. A choice based on one moment of recognition, one moment of guilt, one moment of weakness." Eleanor emerged from the bedroom then, fresh from the shower, her hair wet and her face bare of the careful invisibility she maintained in public spaces. She placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Let me talk to him," she said. David looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her the way most people never did. "He's throwing away everything," David said to her. "For what? To prove to himself that he's a better person than he actually is?" "No," Elena said quietly, "to stop proving to everyone else that he's something he's not." David left after that. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned and walked out, leaving behind the silence of a friendship that had fractured along the fault line of what it meant to prioritize authenticity over ambition. That evening, Marcus received the official notice. His resignation was being accepted effective immediately. His stock holdings would be liquidated according to pre-arranged agreements. His legal obligations to the company were being fulfilled through a succession of contracts that had suddenly become very relevant. In 1 week, the structure that had defined him for 20 years had been dismantled. He realized he'd never felt lighter. Chapter 6. The Revelation. Elena's mother, Rosa, sat in the kitchen of her small apartment and listened to Marcus tell her the truth. Not the polished version he would have told investors or board members, the real truth, the version where he was a coward who'd abandoned Elena because loving her felt like it would slow him down, where every success had been fueled not by ambition but by the need to prove he was worthy of a better life than the one he'd been born into, where all the money had been an attempt to purchase a version of himself that would be acceptable to a world that had taught him, early and often, that boys like him needed to be exceptional just to be ordinary. Rosa listened without speaking, her weathered hands folded on the kitchen table, her eyes, the same brown as Eleanor's, taking in every word. "I had a choice," Marcus said. "I could have been the man Elena deserved, or I could have been the man the world needed. I thought those were mutually exclusive." "Were they?" Rosa asked quietly. "I don't know yet." Rosa stood slowly. She was thinner than she used to be, Marcus noticed, with the fragility that comes from serious illness, and placed her hand on his head like she had when he was younger, when he used to study at their kitchen table before Elena would walk him to the bus stop. "When my daughter came to tell me what happened at the cathedral," Rosa said, "I cried. Not because of the scandal, not because of the money lost. I cried because I finally understood that my daughter had been waiting for you to become the person you already were." She lowered herself back into her chair with effort. "Then I cried for another reason," she continued, "because I realized that what you did, walking away from all of it, that wasn't weakness. That was the first thing you've done that actually took strength." Marcus felt something break open in his chest. "I don't know how to be that person," he said. "The person who can walk away from power." Then you'll learn, Rosa said simply. We all have to learn that eventually. That the things we thought would save us never could. That the only thing that saves us is recognizing the worth of another human being and choosing them, not instead of everything else, alongside everything else. She reached for his hand. Your mother loved you more than her own survival, Rosa said. She worked herself half to death so you could have a chance, not so you could have money, so you could have a choice. And now you finally used it. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see the neighborhood at dusk, the streets where he'd delivered newspapers, the school where he'd met Elena, the bus stop where he'd kissed her for the first time. All of it was still here. All of it had continued existing in the years he'd been trying to outrun it. I don't have much now, he said. I'm going to lose most of my wealth. The company will survive without me. My reputation will survive the damage. But everything I built was a cage. Elena's voice came from the doorway. She'd been listening quietly, her presence as unobtrusive as it had been when she was the invisible maid in the cathedral. You've been living in a cage, and you just found the key. She came to stand between Marcus and her mother. My mother is in remission, Elena said. Did I tell you that? The doctors say that if the next scan comes back clear, she might actually beat this. She's going to live. We're going to have more time. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held all the weight of the years between them. That's what you taught me, she said. When you left, I learned that time is the only real currency. That everything else, the money, the status, the success, is just a claim check for time you think you'll have later. But later never comes if you spend now on building walls instead of opening doors. Rosa squeezed Marcus's hand. She's been waiting for you to figure that out, Rosa said. You're Elena. She's been waiting 11 years for you to understand that success without her wasn't success at all. If this story already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps Marcus and Elena's message reach more people who still believe that redemption is possible when we finally choose what matters most. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The financial fallout was precise and comprehensive. Marcus's net worth dropped from $3 billion to approximately $340 million in the span of 3 weeks. The liquidation of his company holdings, the penalties for breaking his executive contracts, the settlement with Victoria's family, each one was designed to punish the deviation from the expected narrative. But there was something liberating in its totality. With $340 million, he was still extraordinarily wealthy, but he was no longer incomprehensibly so. He could no longer hide in the abstraction of numbers so large they lost meaning. The money now had weight, texture, responsibility. He spent the first month in Elena's neighborhood, not performing charity, but actually being present. He visited his mother's grave for the first time in 8 years. He knocked on the door of the high school guidance counselor who'd believed in him as a teenager. He asked the people who'd known him before success what they remembered about the person he'd been. The answers were humbling. They remembered a boy who asked questions, who listened, who'd never been content with accepted wisdom, who'd worked 3 jobs to help his mother, who'd fallen asleep in the library studying for tests because he couldn't afford the tutoring his competitors had access to, who'd written poetry badly but with genuine feeling, who'd believed that education was revolution. None of them remembered him as ambitious. They remembered him as hopeful, as determined, as human. And they remembered Elena as the girl who'd believed in him more than he'd believed in himself. Marcus began consulting with social causes, not for money, but for clarity. He worked with education non-profits in underserved neighborhoods. He served on boards focused on economic mobility. He didn't publicize any of it. The good work that actually mattered, he discovered, was the work you did when no one was watching, when there was no payoff in perception. The media continued its feast for a while. The abandoned billionaire, the humble maid, the dramatic reversal of fortune. But eventually, the story became boring. There was no scandal to update, no destruction to chronicle. A man had chosen love over power, and then he'd simply lived. The lack of dramatic collapse made it uninteresting. But in those quiet months, something shifted in Marcus that all the therapy and success coaching in the world had never managed to touch. He stopped performing his life and started living it. Elena's mother recovered fully. Her scans came back clear. They celebrated with tea and pastries at a bakery that hadn't changed in 30 years, and Rosa held both their hands across the table like she was holding the entire future. One evening, Marcus and Elena sat on the fire escape of her apartment, looking out over the neighborhood where they'd first met. The city hummed beneath them, the sound of traffic, of voices, of ordinary life continuing without any awareness that extraordinary things had happened within its borders. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "Any of it?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I regret what I lost," he said. "The years, the time we could have had. My mother never knowing where I ended up. But do I regret choosing this, choosing you, choosing to stop running?" He shook his head. "No, that I don't regret." "I was so angry at you," Elena said quietly. "For so long, every time I saw your face in a magazine, every success you had, I felt this rage that you'd become the person you wanted to be at the expense of becoming the person you were supposed to be. But watching you walk away from all of it." She trailed off, unable to find the words. "What?" Marcus pressed gently. "It made me understand that anger was just grief wearing a different face," Elena said. "I was grieving the future we were supposed to have. But maybe, just maybe, we're having it now. 11 years late, but we're having it now." Chapter 8. The Quiet. After the year that followed was the first year of Marcus's life that wasn't documented. He and Elena moved in together to a loft in the neighborhood, modest by his former standards, but comfortable in the way that actually mattered. He enrolled in evening classes at the community college, not for a degree, but because he wanted to be a student again, to sit in classrooms where no one knew his name, to struggle with material that couldn't be solved with money or connections. He volunteered at the community center where he'd played basketball as a teenager. He worked with kids from the neighborhood, teaching them that there were multiple definitions of success, that the pathway out wasn't the only pathway worth taking, that sometimes the most important thing was the choice to stay. Elena returned to school as well. She completed her GED, then started taking classes toward a social work degree. Her official invisibility, the characteristic she'd developed to survive in the spaces where she wasn't supposed to exist, transformed into genuine presence. People listened to her now, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that she had something important to say. Rosa spent her afternoons in the loft, recovered enough to enjoy the life that medical intervention had given her back. She watched her daughter and the boy she'd always believed in, and she knitted complicated sweaters and spoke in a way that made it clear she understood the value of what had been salvaged. The media occasionally tried to revive the story. Marcus's former company went public, its stock soaring past his previous valuations. The financial press attempted to frame this as vindication of his removal, proof that his emotional instability had been the missing piece that would allow the organization to thrive. He didn't respond to the narrative. He'd learned that responding to others' stories about him gave their versions credibility. Instead, he lived quietly. There was a morning in spring when he woke up in the loft next to Elena, sunlight streaming through the uncovered windows, the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, vendors calling out, the ordinary music of human habitation filling the space around them. Elena was still sleeping, her face peaceful, her hand resting on his chest. Outside, the city continued its oblivious continuation. Inside, everything Marcus had spent 20 years running toward had been distilled into this: a woman who knew him, a community that held him, a life that didn't need to be performed. He understood, finally, what his mother had always known, what Rosa had understood, what Elena had believed through all the years of his absence, that you could build anything you wanted, accumulate anything you desired, achieve anything you set your mind to, and still come home empty if you didn't have the one thing that actually mattered: a person who saw you, who knew you, who chose you anyway. Chapter 9. The Epilogue. 2 years after the wedding that never happened, Marcus and Elena got married in the same cathedral where the first ceremony had collapsed. It was a different kind of wedding entirely. No guests from the world of finance or fashion, no live streaming, no press, just their families, their friends from the neighborhood, the people who'd known them before they'd tried to become something else. Rosa walked Elena down the aisle. David stood beside Marcus, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that friendship could survive the revelation of truth. The priest who'd begun the first ceremony was there again, older and wiser, ready to witness what the second one would bring. When Marcus looked at Elena in that moment, no longer the invisible maid, but a woman in a simple white dress, standing in sunlight that came through stained glass windows, he understood what resurrection actually meant. It wasn't about coming back to where you started. It was about being willing to begin again, to believe that it wasn't too late, that the damage could be transformed into something beautiful. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Marcus spoke about the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. Eleanor spoke about waiting and about the faith it took to keep that vigil. They spoke about forgiveness, not as something that erased damage, but as something that transformed it into meaning. When they kissed, the applause was genuine, the sound of people who'd seen the real cost of what had been chosen. Afterward, at the reception in Rosa's church basement, decorated with white orchids, arranged with the same deliberate care that Elena had been using when Marcus recognized her in the cathedral, they danced to music that mattered to no one but them. Rosa sat at a table near the dance floor, fully recovered now, her vitality returned, watching her daughter and the boy she'd always believed in. She was knitting a baby blanket, already anticipating a future that would only become more real, more possible, more blessed. The neighborhood surrounded them in that basement, people who'd seen Marcus become something other than himself, and who'd watched him choose to become himself again. People who'd known Elena before she was reduced to a function, and who'd witnessed her reclaim her fullness. In the corner, David watched his oldest friend with new understanding. He'd spent years around billionaires, around men who'd sacrificed everything for success. But this was the first time he'd seen a man sacrifice success for life. It was the first time he'd understood the difference. Late in the evening, Marcus and Elena slipped outside into the cool night air. The city hummed around them, infinite and ordinary and absolutely beautiful. They walked together through the neighborhood where they'd first met, where they'd learned to love, where they'd learned to let go, where they'd learned to choose each other again. "I was thinking," Elena said, "about the question people always ask. If you could go back, would you do things differently? Would you have stayed with me from the beginning?" Marcus considered it seriously. "I think," he said slowly, "that we needed those 11 years. Not because I deserved to suffer, or because you deserved to learn patience, but because I needed to know what I was choosing when I finally chose you. I needed to understand that love wasn't something you fit into success. Love is the thing that actually matters, and everything else is optional." They walked in silence for a while, their hands intertwined. "My mother used to say," Elena said, "that the purpose of life wasn't to become someone important. It was to become someone worth knowing, to be the kind of person that other people are grateful existed." She squeezed his hand. "I think you finally figured that out." Marcus looked at the streets of his childhood, at the city that had been the backdrop for his transformation, at the woman who'd been the catalyst for his reclamation. "We figured it out together," he said. "It just took a long time for me to catch up." Above them, the city lights held the stars in a complicated dance of illumination. In the distance, the cathedral where everything had changed rose against the night sky, its stone holding the weight of what had been broken and what had been redeemed. And in that moment, Marcus understood that the greatest luxury wealth could provide wasn't money at all. It was the luxury of finally being able to afford the truth, that a human life, lived authentically, in connection with another person, in service to something that mattered, was infinitely more valuable than an empire built on the foundation of a lie. This is the story of a man who was wealthy beyond measure until he discovered something wealth couldn't buy: the price of true recognition. The story of a woman who was invisible to the world until someone finally saw her. The story of how walking away from everything you've built can be the bravest thing you ever do. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, courage, and second chances. Thank you for watching. Black billionaire CEO rejected his fiancée at the altar for recognizing her maid. And remember, one act of recognition can rewrite a destiny.